tonight we're going to talk about money. What more appropriate topic for an economist, right? Although, as I told you in my first lecture, my main reason for being in economics is the way it supports a right understanding of economics supports freedom and individual liberty. But money's important, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to start with a joke that I shared with my Econ 101 students when I'd give them a lecture on money. And I beg your indulgence here. I hope you didn't have a real hard day at work. This is one of those ones where I'm supposed to really draw it out for a long time and then just give you a quick punchline. And my wife begged me to be merciful with you and to condense it. So I'll try to give you the short version here, but it does provide an introduction to the topic of money. This story involves a young guy fresh out of college. He's been working for 6 months at a Midwestern newspaper, and his job is to write a couple of feature articles each week, finding an unusual accomplishment, an unusual person, an unusual thing, just various human interest kinds of stories. And he's very good at it. But one day he's sitting there and he types a few sentences and then he types and deletes. And all of a sudden he realizes he's got writer's block and he's pushing up against his deadline. And finally he realizes it's not going to get done today. So with some trepidations, he goes to his boss, the editor, and he says, "Chief, I don't know how to tell you this, but I've got writer's block." And the chief's a very understanding veteran newspaperman. He says, "Son, it happens to all of us from time to time. Don't worry about it all. What I want you to do is take the rest of the day off. Just go for a little ride out in the country and then just relax." So he heaves a sigh of relief, leaves the building, goes to the parking garage, gets in his car, drives out of town. And, in 15 minutes, he's out in farm country and it's a sunny afternoon and he's cheering up and relaxing, unwinding the whole bit. He thinks, okay, I'll go back to my apartment and finish the day out there, get a few odds and ends done. He happens to glance off to his right side. There's a farm there and he spots a pig with a wooden leg. Well, his antennae go up. He said, well, that could be grounds for a story. I don't know what this is all about. Let's go find out. So he pulls in, knocks on the door, grandfatherly type farmer is there. So very friendly guy, welcomes him. He says, they sit down on the veranda, share some lemonade, exchange some pleasantries, and I'll leave out what the pleasantries are just to move the story along. And then the young man says, I wanted to ask you about that pig over there with the wooden leg. Oh, says the farmer, that is the most amazing pig. He said, last spring we were having heavy rains and you see the way the ground is sloped over there, and my tractor actually tipped over in the mud and I was pinned under it. I wasn't injured, but I couldn't get out. And that pig came over and used his snout and dug out a little trench so I could pull my leg out and everything. Otherwise, I would have been stuck there all day in the rain. And the reporter thinks, oh, that's fantastic. I've got a great story. But what about, and says, not only that, but last summer, our little granddaughter was playing out by the pond over there, and all of a sudden she slipped and she went under the water. She didn't know how to swim. And Grandma and I, we were up here on the porch, we can't move very fast. So we were worried we wouldn't get her in time. But that pig happened to be right there. And that pig just dove into the pond and got himself up underneath our granddaughter and lifted her up and brought her out of the pond and saved her life. Well, the reporter's ecstatic. I mean, he doesn't know if he's going to get a Pulitzer Prize, but this is stuff that his boss wants. I mean, this is great stuff. He said, but what about his wood? Oh, and not only that, said the farmer, there was a time last fall. My wife and I had a long day and we fell asleep and had forgotten to turn the gas stove off, and there was some wind coming through the window and the curtains caught on fire. And this old wooden house could have just burned up like tinder in no time flat. But the pig is sleeping on the front porch and he banged his head on the door real loud and woke us up, so we were able to put the fire out and save ourselves. Reporter is in seventh heaven. This is the greatest story he's ever gotten. But then he says, well, why does the pig have a wooden leg? And the farmer does this double take, like, what kind of idiot asks a question like that? He said, well, heck, son, everyone knows when you got a pig as good as that, you don't eat it all at once. I'm glad you're all on mute so I don't hear the groans there. What does this have to do with money? Well, what was economic life before there was money, or in places where there is no money? How do you do exchange? You do direct exchange, goods for goods. It's called barter. But what if you're a pig farmer and the people you want to exchange with don't like pork and bacon? What you have isn't pretty, very useful for them. Plus, say you're going into market to get, fruit and a bushel of wheat, some eggs, and this type of thing. Well, what are you going to do with the pig? Drag it to the first stall and hack off a leg and say, "Here, take this leg, and I'll take my eggs." And you go to the next stall, hack off another leg. I'm not trying to be gory here. What I'm showing you is how impractical direct exchange often is. So what comes to the rescue? Money. Something that acts as a medium of exchange for indirect exchange. Ludwig von Mises, who I've mentioned before, he was the mentor of my mentor, Dr. Senholz, the Grove City legend. Mises has given the best definition of money that I've ever heard. He says, money is the most marketable good. In other words, a lot of people aren't going to accept part of a pig as payment for something, but they'll accept money because money is that which is easily exchangeable with everybody else. And certain attributes or qualities led to certain kinds of money being developed. Here's a question for you. Do you know who invented money? It's kind of a trick question. I ask that to students to kind of get them to think and to ponder. But there's really no answer to it any more than you can say who invented language. Both language and money were just devised along the way for their utility. There was a need, and somebody said, "Well, let's do this." So what makes the best money? Well, how about something that's small, easily portable, easily divisible, something that people, do attach a value to, something that can be standardized, and something that's durable. I mean, things like fruit and animals, and things like that, they're not durable at all. So they're not good for money. So metals, hunks of metal, evolved in most places as the best money. Now, where there weren't metals, there were some South Pacific Islanders who would use seashells or whatever. Prisoners of war famously used cigarettes. Now, the cigarettes are not all that durable. They get consumed, but in the short run, you can make an exchange. But metals work the best. I'm going to do a little show and tell with you here. I don't know. I hope you can, well, you're not going to see much detail on these little bits of copper. The Greek word is lepton, or the plural is lepta. It's like, I think the most common mistakes you hear in the English language are words like phenomenon and phenomena. The ON is the singular form, the A is the plural form. Well, these are two lepta, which was the smallest unit of currency in biblical times. You know the story in Mark where the old widow throws 2 mites into the treasury and Jesus praised her generosity because it was all she had? Well, that's what these are. These are 2,000-year-old biblical mites, or technically lepta. Is either one that she used? Probably the odds are pretty long against it, but maybe, who knows? Can you imagine those 2 little crudely hammered out semi-discs of copper being the sole financial assets of a person? That's poverty. Precious metals, of course, were valued more highly. This is, again, I don't know if the light's very good. I don't know if you can make that out. That's Caesar Augustus. That's a silver denarius, again, from the time of Jesus' time on earth here. Money became widely used just because of its utility, its use as a medium of exchange. It's also useful for accounting, to just keep track of it. It's like a common denominator. You express everything in terms of how many of these bits of silver or gold or copper or whatever's being used, how many of those units are worth this much, and so on and so forth. And that's how you set prices. That's how you compute profit and loss. I mean, the accounting aspect of money is very, very helpful. And so first you have money as a medium of exchange. Money itself isn't wealth. Up until the 1700s, the late 1700s, economic thought in Europe was dominated by the mercantilist philosophy. And they actually believed that money was wealth. And so like the monarchs of Europe were in this mad competition to see which of them could accumulate the most money. In other words, they wanted to export goods, food and lumber, et cetera, to other countries so that they could have money. So you have to ask yourself, well, who's really got a higher standard of living? The people with the most money stashed in a vault, or the people with the most wood to make houses and food to eat and so on and so forth? But nonetheless, the superstition or the myth persisted that money was wealth. And Adam Smith exploded that myth, as he did so many others. He said, no, it's not. It's a medium of exchange. I mean, if money were wealth, we could just have the Federal Reserve today print all of us $10 million and live happily ever after. But if all that money was created, we wouldn't be any wealthier at all. There wouldn't be any more cell phones, there wouldn't be any more cars, there wouldn't be any more food, wouldn't be any more clothes, shelters, et cetera. Money it's the most marketable good, but its function is to serve as a medium of exchange between the goods that we actually consume. And it's supposed to be a store of value. Okay, medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. It's nice when money does preserve value or purchasing power, but we'll be talking about inflation in a little bit, and guess what? That means that money's losing purchasing power. It does not always act in the ideal sense of being a store of value. Sometimes it's not an effective store of value. I think we'll get into Bitcoin later too, because so many people have an interest in that. And it has its pros and its cons. And I'll tell you up front, I'm not the biggest authority of Bitcoin. I'm not a fan of it. I'm not an enemy of it. But let me tell some of this other story first. Let's fast forward to the founding of the United States of America. We have the Revolutionary War. Now, when I was a kid, we all knew what the phrase "not worth a continental" meant. During the 1770s, the Continental Congress created a paper currency called Continental dollars. Here's an example. If it looks faded, it's because it is faded. I'll read it to you. And it's hand signed. I mean, these bills were all hand signed. It goes a lot faster now. This bill entitles the bearer to receive 6 Spanish milled dollars, or the value thereof in gold or silver. So this is a receipt. It's a claim check for real money. It's not money itself, but it was mandated by the Continental Congress to be used as money, to be accepted as money. It was a promise to pay money at some future time. And of course, human temptation being what it is, Congress found it to its advantage to increase the printing of those Continental dollars. It's a lot easier and faster to just crank out the printing press, literally, and print a bunch of those notes than it is to go out in the wilderness and mine some gold or silver and then mint it in coins. And of course, what happens when you make the supply of something super abundant? The marginal value of each unit goes down, 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 down. The purchasing power collapses. And that's where the phrase "not worth a continental" came from. Because by the time the Continental Congress was done hyperinflating, super charging the creation of those things, each unit was worth very, very little. The purchasing power went way down, and people didn't want to accept them. But I'm going to share with you a few. I'm going to have to read them. I don't have these quotes memorized. It gives you an idea of the attitude that our founders had. Remember, they fought the revolution, and they didn't really have money. You know, we know how impoverished George Washington's troops were. I've got a quote here from Washington that he wrote in a letter in 1787. He basically told his correspondent, who lived in Rhode Island, that paper money ruins commerce, oppresses the honest, and opens the door to every species of fraud and injustice. That's not a very positive endorsement of paper money, is it? But of course, Washington had just lived through the ravages of the hyperinflation of the continental dollar. Now we have, there's a little known patriot, a founding father. If any of you attended a talk I gave at one of those Pittsburgh luncheons, and I gave this about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, about Pelatiah Webster. If there's any single founding father that our country should know more about, it's he. Man had an amazing life. He was the oldest son. He started off as a minister. His father died. The family needed support. He became a merchant, became very, very successful, ended up writing books. The guy was brilliant. He just had all sorts of insights. Now, when the continental money was only 5 months old, American colonists were balking at accepting it. I mean, they wanted real money. You know, they didn't want to, they weren't real sure. They didn't have a whole lot of confidence in the Congress was going to be able to redeem this money in the future. So the Continental Congress passed this resolution, quote, whoever should refuse to receive in payment continental bills should be deemed and treated as an enemy of his country and be precluded from all trade and intercourse with the inhabitants. Wow, that's pretty harsh. But that was the compulsion that was needed to do this. Well, Pelatiah Webster says this is ridiculous. He says to call anything a pound or a shilling, which really is not so, and make it a legal standard is an error of the same nature as diminishing the standard bushel, yard, or gallon, or making a law that a foot shall be the legal yard and an ounce the legal pound. And you could see what, I mean, his logic is impeccable. And then compelling people to receive those goods by such deficient measures. It was a swindle. It was defrauding people. It wasn't honest. Plus, most of these continentals were promises to pay at some future time. Well, usually if you're deferring receipt of payment, you charge interest. There was no interest being credited to these things. You know, it's called time preference in economics. $1 today is worth more than $1 next year. A bird in the hand's worth 2 in a bush. And then Pelatiah Webster goes on to say, the law which obliges a man to accept these bills instead of ready cash obliges him to receive a less valuable thing in full payment of a more valuable one and injures him to the amount of the difference. And he goes on to say that this is a violation of the laws of justice. No legislature on earth should have the right to infringe or abrogate this freedom of choice in the exchange of goods for goods. And then he says something that is a century ahead of his time. In the 1870s, the Austrians finally figured out what value was. You know, Adam Smith and the classical economists did not know what value was. They didn't know that it was subjective. Something's only valuable if we impute value to it, if we think it's value, if we attach value to it. Webster wrote in the 1770s, a century before Menger and the Austrians, the credit or value of money cannot, in the very nature of the thing, be supplied, preserved, or restored by penal laws or any coercive methods. The subject is incompatible to force, because value is what you voluntarily give something. He says, it is not more absurd to attempt to impel faith into the heart of an unbeliever by fire or to whip love into your mistress with a cowskin than to force value or credit into your money by penal laws. Webster was a great champion of liberty. He was an economist ahead of his time. And a little added bonus, he was probably more responsible for our United States Constitution than anybody else. You know, Madison generally gets the credit for being the father of our Constitution. Madison, by the way, who was 25 years younger than Pelatiah Webster, when the Continental Congress would meet in Philadelphia, where Webster lived, Madison would hang out at Webster's house and listen to the guy share his wisdom. And in 1783, Pelatiah Webster published a book. I've got a little something here somewhere, and I lost it. Oh no, here it is. The book that Webster published in 1783 basically articulated the principles that Madison and others hammered out half a decade later and created the Constitution. And unlike, there's a document in biblical history called Q, which is supposed to be the source of the common source of, you know, the synoptic gospels have a lot of the same stories, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they were all drawn from a common source, but that source is hypothetical. It's called Q, but it's never been found. Well, the different schools or factions that were proposing the Constitution all borrowed their elements from Pelatiah Webster's book. The difference is that book does survive. You can get it free online. If you go to just Google Pelatiah Webster, and it's the first book. It's called A Dissertation on the Political Union and Constitution of the 13 United States of America, which was published at Philadelphia by Pelatiah Webster, February 16th, 1783. Prior to that date in question, no single element of his theory had ever been propounded by anyone. And there was a historian and constitutional scholar who in 1908 got the US Senate to accept a resolution memorializing Pelatiah Webster, calling his work, his book, a pivotal chapter in the history of the Constitution that will impress upon succeeding generations the all-important fact that every basic principle which differentiates our existing federal system from all that have preceded it was a part of a single invention struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of one man. And that man was Pelatiah Webster. Okay, that was a digression, but I think Pelatiah deserves his moment in the sun. But he definitely was opposed to this use of force to compel people to accept these Continentals that ended up being not worth anything. Now, the result of the horrible experience with the Continentals and all the deprivation that accompanied it was that when our founders sat down to hammer out the Constitution, they wanted to spare their posterity the pains of paper money. And so if you read Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, one of the paragraphs bestows on Congress the power, the exclusive power, quote, to coin money, regulate the value thereof. Now, in an economic sense, you can't regulate value, but regulate back then meant to make regular, to set it according to a fixed rule. So, for example, everything called a dime would have the same identical number of grains of silver in it. And notice it says to coin money, not to print money. And if that isn't enough to make you think that our founders were mandating metallic money for our use, not paper money. It also says in Article 1, Section 10, where it limits the powers of states, it says, no state shall coin money. No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Now I ask you, when's the last time any of you got a state tax refund that was redeemable in gold or silver? Those days are long gone, before any of us were even born. But we're using unconstitutional money when you get right down to it. mean, there's nothing in the Constitution authorizing the printing of paper money, but it's very explicit in the Constitution that we're to coin metallic money. Okay. Brief history of money in the United States. The first Money Act, I think it was passed in 1790, it defined the dollar both in terms of gold and silver. It was X grains of gold or X grains of silver. They call it a bimetallic standard because it involved both gold and silver. And they found out that was kind of problematical because the official exchange rate was, under the Money Act, was set at 15 to 1, 15 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. But in the marketplace, the exchange rate was 15.5 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. So the Money Act overvalued silver. As money, it would take 15 ounces of silver to get 1 ounce of gold out in the marketplace. It would cost you 15.5. So you wouldn't buy it in the marketplace, you'd use it as money. Conversely, gold, okay, if gold as money would only give you 15 ounces of silver worth of stuff, but in the private marketplace, you could give somebody an ounce of gold and get 15.5 ounces of silver. Well, duh, you would choose the 15.5 ounces of silver. Rational people do that. And so the gold money would be withdrawn from circulation because it was worth more not as money. This is the famous economic law called Gresham's Law. It's named after Thomas Gresham, who was a minister of finance under Queen Elizabeth I in the late 1500s. It's commonly stated bad money drives out good money, which it's sort of accurate, but I always teach my students, it's when the non-monetary exchange value of something is higher than its monetary exchange value, it will be in the non-monetary marketplace. On the other hand, if you can get more bang for your buck, so to speak, using it as money, you'll use it as money. So because silver was overvalued, we used silver money in the early years of our republic. Well, they got tired of that. So in 1834, they said, well, let's change it. So they changed it, Congress passed and changed the exchange rate to 16 to 1. Problem is, the market was still using an exchange rate of 15.5 ounces to 1. Now, gold was overvalued. Silver was worth more in the non-monetary marketplace than as money. So silver withdrew from circulation according to Gresham's law. So silver coins quit circulating and gold coins were used instead. And then we had an interruption of sound money. It was called the Civil War. And we had another instance of the destructiveness of paper money. So the South, the Confederacy, there's a $10 bill, and you can see the back of it's just very simple. There's a $100 bill. They weren't bashful about depicting a couple of slaves at the top working in the field. The back is essentially empty except for some handwritten endorsement by some official. Sorry, I see the images on the front are bleeding through. So anyhow, Confederate money was the same as Continental money. It was hyperinflated. Its purchasing power went way, way down. That crippled the South. The North engaged in that to some extent. Lincoln introduced these things called United States notes. You notice the red seal on this $5 bill. The number was capped at something like 348 million, which today's a drop in the bucket. But back in the 1860s, that was a lot of money. And in perpetuity, there are 348, or I don't know the exact number, dollars of these bills printed. And of course, most of them are collector's things, collector's items. So I've kept them. By the way, during the late 1800s, the one on the bottom, the $5 bill with the red seal, that's the size of currency today. The one above it, which of all presidents, it depicts Grover Cleveland, who's actually one of my favorites because he vetoed a lot of stupid legislation. Anyhow, those were called horse blankets, but that was the typical size of our paper currency up until about the First World War. So eventually, though, Franklin Roosevelt, 1933, confiscated the people's gold. You know, this was during the emergency of the Great Depression, and he just practiced intervention after intervention. So he confiscated the people's gold and promptly devalued the dollar. So it's kind of a defrauding the public. And then we kept spending, and we quit using silver to mint our quarters and dimes after 1965. Because what happened was, as our inflationary policies expanded, the market price of silver was worth more than a dime or a quarter. In other words, the silver in a dime or a quarter was worth more in the marketplace for silver than it was as money. Gresham's law. You know, I mean, I remember having all those silver coins. You'd stand in the store waiting to buy your ice cream cone or whatever, and you could feel that silver getting warm in your hand because silver is a really good conductor of heat. The zinc-clad slugs we use now don't do that. But that's why we quit. You know, this silver was withdrawn from circulation by intelligent people who said, hey, wait a minute. If it's worth more not as money than as money, I'd be a fool to use it as money. So they withdrew it from circulation. And of course, in 1971, you know, Roosevelt had forbidden Americans to use gold. Well, we were still redeeming foreign balances of account with foreign nations by paying with gold. Well, the inflation of the 60s was such that we had to stop doing this. And Nixon in 71 shut the gold window. And we've had a total unbacked paper currency ever since. It's called fiat currency, the Latin word for let there be, you know, like lux fiat, let there be light. Well, fiat, let this be money. And that's what we've got today. We've got money that's backed by even less than the continental dollar. The continental dollar was at least a promise. Maybe you'd get some silver for it in the future. They're not even pretending anymore. Got a question for you. Why do you think cars, computers, cell phones, gadgets, TVs, etc., why does the quality of these things improve over the years? And then ask yourself this. Well, those are all important economic goods, highly valued economic goods. But the most valuable one, the one that has the most utility, is money. I mean, it's certainly the economic good that's used more than any other. Is its quality getting better? No. Now, when the dollar was backed by precious metals, surprise, surprise, in 1915, prior to the outbreak of the First World War, the purchasing power of the dollar was essentially the same as it had been a century earlier in 1815. In other words, when backed by precious metals, the dollar served as an effective store of value, not only a medium of exchange and a unit of account, but the third function, a store of value. Now, how about since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and then since Roosevelt took the gold out of the hands of people, and now we've got this fiat currency? Well, today's Federal Reserve note has maybe 2 cents, 2.5 cents. I mean, the different indexes measure it slightly differently, but only a tiny fraction of the purchasing power that it had a century ago. You know, for 1 century there, the purchasing power of the dollar stayed the same because it was backed by precious metals. Now we've got a fiat currency, and it's lost close to 98% of its purchasing power. In other words, its quality has gone downhill in a very serious way. Well, why? Why don't Americans say, wait a minute, this is garbage money you're paying me with. I want real money. Well, it's because government imposes legal tender laws. That's what Pelatiah Webster was objecting to, the government compelling people to accept these things as currency. The other goods that I mentioned, like cars and TVs, why do they get better? Competition. Is there competition in our currency? No, it's a government monopoly. You know, it's interesting, some of the government bureaucrats fret and fuss about private monopolies. And, you know, we see, well, the real monopolies like the US Post Office. The biggest monopoly is the federal government controlling the money and not allowing competition. And without the competition, the quality of money just keeps going down and down and down. And it's every man for himself. You just have to figure out how to survive those things. You know, there are two diseases of money: inflation and deflation. Inflation gets most of the publicity, at least during our lifetime, because it's been the more common one during our lifetime. In the 20s, you had a bad deflation. You had a couple bad deflations. A deflation is where prices in general fall instead of rise. It's where the unit of account, the currency, the money, increases in purchasing power. Now, if you're a saver, if you've got money saved up, you kind of like deflation. Because when you're ready to spend it in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, whatever, you're going to be able to buy more for it than you can today. Deflation is helpful to savers. But inflation is helpful to debtors because it enables you to pay back your debt in nominal dollars that have less purchasing power than what you got when you borrowed it. Inflation decreases the purchasing power of each unit and deflation increases it. So deflation favors savers, inflation favors borrowers. Got a question for you. Who's the largest borrower of money in the world? If you say Uncle Sam, go to the head of the class. 31.4 trillion. That's just on the books. It's really more. It's in Uncle Sam's interest to inflate the currency. I was appalled in the previous decade. The Federal Reserve's stated policy was to depreciate the dollar at the modest rate of 2% a year. Well, that means in 20 years, you've lost 1/3 of your purchasing power. I mean, the Federal Reserve was supposedly created to uphold and preserve the value of the currency. Not anymore. And of course, in the last couple of years, it's gotten out of hand. We've had this blip in inflation. I think it's coming down. How much it will, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But you can see the dynamics here. You can see the incentives. I mean, Uncle Sam's never going to pay off $31.4 trillion. So actually, it wouldn't be Uncle Sam paying it off. It'd be our children. We can't do that to them. So the debt's either going to be at some point forsaken, disavowed, welched on, or it's going to be bled away by inflation. Isn't that a cheery prospect? Sorry about that, but that's it. Inflation's gone on a long time, and sometimes it gets quite extreme. Got another show and tell to do for you here. This may look like game money or a joke, because this is a bill for $100 trillion, which is about the GDP of the world, and I'm holding it in my hand. But it's 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. This bill was printed by the central bank. This is not game money. This was printed by the Central Bank of Zimbabwe, which is now, I think, called the Republic of the Congo, just 10 or 15 years ago. They had a hyperinflation. You know, you've all heard of the German hyperinflation. My gosh, that was awful. Prior to World War I, I mean, this is how devastating a hyperinflation can be. A loaf of bread before World War I in Germany, I don't know how many pfennigs it was, but it was the equivalent of 13 US cents. After the war in 1919, it doubled to 26 cents. 1920, $1.20. Middle of 1922, $3.50 for that same loaf of bread. January 23, $7. No, excuse me, $700. September of 1923, this is just 1 century ago this year now. September of 1923, one loaf of bread, $2 million. October of 23, $670 million. November, $3 billion. And the middle of November, it got up to $100 billion. I used to show my students photographs, you can probably pull them offline, of Germans taking bundles of cash and stuffing them into their stoves. That was another example of Gresham's law in action. Money will go to where it's valued the most. And it got to the point in Germany where a whole wad of bills, and they might have been 1,000-mark bills, a whole wad of those were worth more to provide a couple of hours of heat for a family in a stove than as currency. Devastating stuff, that hyperinflation. And the monetary shenanigans, like this thing of negative interest rates that a lot of the national banks pursued, and the Fed did to some extent, zero interest rate. I mean, they crammed short-term interest rates down to just a tiny fraction, and at 2% price inflation a year, we had negative real interest rates. Some banks were actually charging explicitly negative interest rates. You put your money on deposit, and your interest rate might have been minus 0.5%. It gives me an idea. I was thinking of starting a business. If each one of you will send me $1,000, I promise, cross my heart, in 1 year to send you $990. Negative interest rates. What a deal. I don't think so. Seems like a swindle to me. That's what's happened to public finance. That's what's happened to central banking in our world today. It's just nutso. Sorry, that's not a very professional way of putting it, but I don't know what else to say. It just is crazy. Okay, let me kind of wrap it up a little bit. Well, what's the alternative? And one alternative that some people really like is Bitcoin, which I think first appeared in 2010. I'm not I could be off a year. I don't remember hearing about it. And I wrote about it for Forbes in 2013. Blockchain is a very interesting and I think promising technology. I think it's going to be very handy in terms of keeping records of deeds of land and property and so on and so forth. And I'm sure they'll find other applications. For money, I don't think so. If the primary definition of money is that money acts as a medium of exchange, it needs to be handy. You need to be able to say, okay, I'll buy that pizza for $10. And I remember the Wall Street Journal sent somebody out to do that. To buy a pizza using Bitcoin, and they found a pizza parlor that would accept Bitcoin. So the charge was $10. So they figured out what the exchange rate for the Bitcoin was. Well, the transaction had to go through multiple stages. Other people in the blockchain, I guess, had to approve it or something. The exchange finally went through that night, but it ended up being over $70 because the exchange value of Bitcoin fluctuated that much. I mean, you've seen what's gone on in the last few years. It went from 6,000 to 60,000. Now it's down to 20 or 22, whatever it is. I think what appeals to people about Bitcoin is that the government can't get at it, at least yet. Who knows what they'll try to do in regard to Bitcoin. Another thing that appeals is that there's a finite amount. In other words, when all these tokens or whatever they call them are mined, when they go through the mathematical, I guess it consumes a lot of electricity, but anyhow, when they mine them all, there's going to be a set number, like 29 million or something like that. Now, is that enough units to serve as a currency? I think theoretically it probably is. I mean, it might mean that a pack of gum might cost, 100,000th of a Bitcoin or something like that. But I mean, it would all be mathematics. So you just divide, you can do it. But I still feel uneasy about Bitcoin. It seems to me to be a bit of a gamble. There's this investing theory called the greater fool theory. You can overpay for a stock and you'll still make money if a greater fool, I'm not being personal with any of you here, believe me, but if somebody else will come along and pay an even higher price. So the people that get into Bitcoin, they're not really using it as money. I don't even think they're using it as a store of value. I think they're speculating. I think they're hoping that it will triple or quadruple in value. And it might. I don't have any predictions about Bitcoin, folks. It might be a very valuable investment for you. It could really pay off, or it could not. But one of the things that bothers me, it's a little bit like multi-level marketing. I don't know if any of you have ever worked for Amway. It's a pretty good system, but the guy at the top always gets a little piece of all the action. Same thing with Bitcoin. The people that got in first, boy, they're worth hundreds of millions now. I'm sure the guy that started it was a multi-billionaire based on the market cap of what Bitcoin is. I think I read once that 30% of Bitcoin is owned by under 1,000 people. Think about that. If that eventually becomes the currency of the country, you're going to have 1,000 people or less somewhere in the world who are going to own like close to a third of it. There's a lot of kings that would have liked to have had that big a share of the national wealth. So it's not really money, but it could pay off for you big time. And I think I'll stop there because I don't want to misspeak. I don't know the future. I think I've told you that before. I'm only an economist. I don't know the future. But I've prattled on here for about 50 minutes. I can always say on these Zoom lectures, you've been a great audience. You haven't made a sound. Of course, you're all on mute. So, I mean, for all I know, you're tearing your hair out at the other end because I can't see you or hear you or whatever. But if you're still with me, thank you for hanging in there. And if you have any sort of questions about, money or inflation, I'll try to say something reasonably intelligent in response. Who knows? So fire away, folks. Or also, listen, if any of you have an idea for a future topic that you'd like me to cover, let me know. I'm kind of contemplating for the next one, climate change as the back door to socialism. The socialism is the economic angle. And I published a book a few years ago about climate change. It was an ebook for the Committee for Constructive Tomorrow called the Big Picture, the Science, Economics, and Politics of Climate Change. And it's important stuff. It's one of the central economic issues of our time, central economic and political issues of our time. And so I'm thinking of addressing that in the future. But okay, enough. Aaron, you want them to, should they send direct questions to you or?
Yeah, one gentleman's question is on a cashless society, if you can expand on that.
A cashless society. I'm assuming that you'll want a certain degree of normalcy, which means economic exchanges. I mean, none of us is self-sufficient. Our society depends on economic exchange. Money lubricates exchange. It provides the means for indirect exchange so we don't have to settle for pig legs if we don't like pigs. So there needs to be some unit, some money or money substitute or quasi money that will continue to serve as a medium of exchange. I mean, there's a need for something like that. So I think what you're asking is, what form would money be in a cashless society? My answer is I don't know, but I'd like to see open competition. I'd like to see different private providers come up with their own concept of money and let the marketplace, the masses of people, if enough people value it, it's like a typical entrepreneurial venture. You make something hoping that people will embrace it. Sometimes you crash and burn, sometimes they embrace it and you become rich. So I'm all for open competition. I'd love to see a repeal of legal tender laws, because that would get rid of the government monopoly. That would enable the force of competition to work on money the same way it's been working to improve our cell phones and computers and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know what a cashless society, what the money substitute, money 2A, whatever you want to call it, would be, but the market would figure it out. Hope that helps a little bit.
Another question is, would you comment on the minimum wage? Do you see it increasing as a good thing or bad thing?
I never think it's a good idea for government to interfere with private citizens making mutually acceptable contracts. The minimum wage has gone up quite a bit. It ends up being a moot point in places where the market wage is already above the minimum wage. The idea that somehow you can just legislate higher wages and everybody can afford it, that's not necessarily true. Basic economic theory explains that, generally speaking, and there's always exceptions. So I don't want to say this is 100% airtight rule, but generally speaking, if you price something above the market clearing price, above where demand meets supply, you end up with a surplus. You end up with more people willing to work at that wage than are willing to pay that wage. There's a great book. I think you can get it online for free. It was published by the Foundation for Economic Education decades ago. The website for the Foundation for Economic Education is just fee.org, FEE.org. And Baldy Harper, gosh, what were his initials? W something Harper? F.A. Harper, F.A. Harper wrote a book called Why Wages Rise. I should call it a booklet. This is not a long read. You could read it in an hour. It's like, I don't know, 60 pages, 70 pages, something like that. But I mean, he basically provides the evidence to show that what drives wages higher is the increased productivity of the workers, which is a function of capital investment. I wrote an article for Institute for Faith and Freedom over a decade ago in praise of capitalist exploitation. You look back at Pittsburgh's history, the awful, harsh work that the steel workers had to do for Andrew Carnegie in the 1870s and 80s. It was awful, and the pay was low. But the reason the pay was low was because there was a surplus of workers. If Jones said, hey, this is for the birds, I'm out of here, there'd be 10 people waiting to take his job. Wages got higher, not because the government ordered them to go up, but for two reasons. One is the demand for labor increased. The problem wasn't that Andrew Carnegie was a greedy capitalist, and I'm not going to debate whether he's greedy or not, but it was that there were not enough greedy capitalists bidding for the services of these workers. And as this country got more and more prosperous, there were more and more people with more and more entrepreneurial ideas, starting more and more businesses, needing more and more employees to create more and more goods and services. And this increased demand for labor pushed labor up, as did the increase in capital formation, because a person assisted by some sort of technology or machinery is more productive than a person just using his human labor. And so I think that minimum wage legislation is more political in its orientation than it is economic. I think it can be anti-economic, but it's a fundamental issue of freedom. I mean, if you've got somebody willing to work there, let them work. Instead, you know what happens. I remember getting kind of annoyed. There was some fellow that was married and had 2 kids, and he said, "Make McDonald's pay me more." And I'm saying to myself, "Wait a minute, buddy. You've got a responsibility there. You got a wife and 2 kids. You better get a job where you're doing something more valuable for your fellow citizen. Because I mean, the more valuable it is for your fellow citizen, the higher the wage is. You know, wages are a function of how much people value your labor. Why does a doctor make more money than a school teacher? Well, because there are fewer, but also because the training is so much more advanced and the skills considered more necessary. So he gets compensated more because people value his labor more highly, or her labor more highly. So sorry if that was a little long-winded. Politically, sometimes politicians feel the pressure to raise minimum wages because they don't want to appear heartless to the poor or whatever. But really what helps the poor more than anything else is free market capitalism and private investment and private employers trying to make a profit and putting people to work. So I guess I'm old-fashioned. I'd say let the market work.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I see there's somebody on the page here with a hand up. I don't know if you can access Craig's 2018 iPhone. Is that?
Yeah, I can go to that question. It's can we go to the gold standard, and what benefit would it bring?
The gold standard is a monetary standard appropriate for an honest society. Ouch. There's a part of me that would love us to go back to a gold standard, because if every unit of currency has to be backed by gold, well, guess what? You cannot possibly inflate the supply of gold nearly as rapidly as you can inflate the price, the quantity of paper currency or bookkeeping entries, you know, on a computer. So gold acts as a natural brake against inflationary policies. But when you have a democratic mob majority insisting that government is Santa Claus and demanding that government give them various benefits, the politicians buckle under the pressure and they give it. And so our government spends more than it's, you know, and the people are not willing to be taxed for it. You know, the people like Santa Claus, not the Grinch. Santa Claus is a government who gives you stuff. Grinch is that mean old guy who wants to tax you to pay for it. Shame on him. All the incentives are for deficits. You know, you can blame the Democrats. You can blame the Republicans, who, when they get a majority, guess what? The deficit doesn't go down. The national debt keeps going up. But it's not the fault of the Democrats or the Republicans. It's systemic. And it's this ethos that has corrupted and corroded our entire society, this idea of getting something for nothing. And that inevitably leads to overspending, so that even if we say, let's adopt a gold standard, if we keep overspending, we'll definitely have to go off the gold standard. And I just don't think we have the will to do it. It's like I read earlier in our Constitution. According to our Constitution, our money should be coins, gold and silver. It's explicit. But we did not have the national will and consecration to our Constitution to uphold it, to abide by it. You know, we're using these fiat currency things, this counterfeit excuse for money, even though our Constitution says we can't. So the gold standard is kind of like the Constitution. I mean, you can put it into law and say, here it is, has to be that way. But if the American people really don't want it to be that way, it isn't going to be that way. No matter how well-intentioned the words are written on a piece of paper or embodied in some legislation or even in a Constitution, the popular will seems to carry the day. And so I just don't think, as much as I wish we lived in the kind of world where a gold standard would work, I don't think we live in the kind of society where a gold standard will work. pains me to say that because I have a natural appreciation of the virtues of a gold standard, but I just think it's totally impracticable in the United States of America today.